Greetings, everyone. I think it would be good for the speakers to turn on their video. I'm Nate Persley. I'm the co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, and I'm thrilled to hand over the reins for today's discussion to Kelly Bourne of the Hewlett Foundation. Needless to say, today is quite a day in the history of content regulation and the internet, given what's happening on Capitol Hill. So the topic of today's discussion could not be more timely, and so we're thankful that our own Becca Lewis is here to do that. Kelly is not only director, obviously at the Hewlett Foundation, but also affiliated with us here in the Cyber Policy Center and a leader in her own right on these issues. So Kelly, I will turn this over to you, and I will recede to the audience and listen to what Becca has to say.
Thank you, Nate. Great to see everyone here. And Nate, speaking of big days in the field, it was great to see the legislation that was introduced earlier today. I think we should go ahead and drop that into the chat if someone has a copy of it, because I think many of us, myself included, were very excited to see that. Really glad to be here today. Really glad to have Becca Lewis with us. Becca is a PhD candidate in communication research and theory here at Stanford. She is also a graduate affiliate at the University of North Carolina's Center on Information Technology and Public Life. And before that, Becca was with the think tank Data and Society in New York, a think tank that I've done a lot of work with as well as a funder, and she was part of the Media Manipulation and Research Initiative there. So really glad to have Becca here. Maybe just a couple of words to introduce her research. Becca has done very thoughtful ethnographic and qualitative research amongst other kinds over the years. Her research has often argued against the conventional wisdom that the recommendation algorithm on YouTube is the primary source for the kind of radicalization and amplification of far-right content that we're seeing online, and has argued instead that micro-celebrities, the sort of popular influencers online have played an important role here. And I think at one point, Becca had gone so far as to argue that you could basically remove the YouTube algorithm in its entirety, and that YouTube would still remain one of the most significant sources for online radicalization and propaganda online. And I think it's important to note that while the algorithm is responsible for something, I believe, like 70% of user time spent on these platforms, it's just one of a number of factors that influence the content that we see on YouTube, including YouTube's search function, the homepage ranking algorithms, and the various incentives that they set up for content producers that allows them to monetize their own content. So Becca, really excited to hear about your latest research. I think what we'll do today is turn it over to Becca for about 30 or 40 minutes to present what she's working on now. And then we will leave another 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So if folks want to go ahead and introduce their questions, I'll go ahead and do my best to moderate those and talk through that with Becca then. So Becca, why don't you go ahead and jump in?
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. And thanks to the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and the Hewlett Foundation for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and getting my presentation up for everyone to see. Let's see, share screen. And we have, let's see, share, present. All right, I can't see people on the video screen, but I assume someone will message me if people can't see this. So hopefully this is fine. Yes, I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you everyone for being on the Zoom call. This is, as everyone was mentioning already, what a landmark day and couple of weeks in the world of digital media platforms. I feel a little guilty because I'm not going to be talking about Facebook today, and I'm also not going to be talking about policy today. But I am going to be talking about issues that I think are deeply related to both, and I hope that potentially in the Q&A section we can kind of grapple with what the implications are. So I've spent the past 5+ years conducting empirical research on white supremacist and male supremacist communities online, and specifically on the digital media that they produce. And I've frequently focused on the ways that propaganda and disinformation are produced and disseminated, specifically on YouTube. And when I tell people that I research far-right content on YouTube, I usually get some version of the same response. People say they've heard that the YouTube recommendation algorithm is drawing people into rabbit holes where they get radicalized into far-right extremism. And I understand why that's people's first reaction. Over the past 4 years, the idea of algorithmic radicalization on YouTube has become ubiquitous in headlines, on podcasts, and on TV. And just as ubiquitous has been the metaphor of the rabbit hole, suggesting that YouTube's algorithms figuratively transport users from a safe part of the platform to the deep, dark corners where racism festers and thrives. Academics and journalists alike have taken up the issue with great enthusiasm and urgency. And a range of recent research has thus been guided by the question, is the YouTube algorithm radicalizing people to the far right? Or another variation of this question is the YouTube algorithm leading people down far right rabbit holes? The consensus among journalists and in popular media has been a resounding yes. For example, in an influential column in the New York Times in 2018, the scholar Zeynep Tufekci argued that YouTube's business model leads to attempts to keep users on the platform at all costs, and that as a result, recommendation algorithms feed users increasingly extreme videos over time to keep their interest peaked. This inches viewers towards more and more radical viewpoints, or so the argument goes. In 2019, the tech journalist Kevin Roos lent support to this theory in his in-depth profile of a young man named Caleb Kane, who found himself adopting far-right ideas after watching a large amount of YouTube. In a follow-up podcast about YouTube, the New York Times leaned especially heavily on the rabbit hole imagery, using the phrase as the name of the podcast and giving individual episodes names like Wonderland and Looking Down. Academics have been a bit more split in their responses. A series of academic studies over the past several years have found evidence that the YouTube recommendation algorithm can expose people to far-right content. For example, O'Callaghan and his co-authors found that users accessing an extreme right YouTube video are likely to be recommended further extreme right content, leading to immersion in an ideological bubble in just a few short clicks. A few years later, Ribeiro and his co-authors found that the algorithm can easily lead people from one political community online to another. For example, from the so-called intellectual dark web to the so-called alt-right. That said, a more recent set of scholarship has rejected these claims, arguing that in fact, there's no observable radicalization effect from the algorithm. Ledvich and Zaitsev, for example, write that their data suggests that YouTube's recommendation algorithm actually actively discourages viewers from visiting radicalizing or extremist content. Similarly, Hossein Mardi and her co-authors write that they find no evidence that engagement with far-right content is caused by YouTube recommendations systematically, nor do they find clear evidence that so-called anti-woke channels serve as a gateway to the far right. In my own research on far-right YouTube, I've been something of an outlier in this debate. As Kelly mentioned, I have largely ignored the algorithm in my work. In fact, I've long argued that we need to look beyond the algorithm to understand how white and male supremacist propaganda spreads on YouTube and more generally online. Throughout 2018 and 2019, I published research arguing we should turn our attention to other dynamics of online propaganda. For example, I identified a loosely networked group of YouTubers who promoted a range of reactionary ideas and connected with audiences using the tactics of traditional social media influencers, using intimacy, personal storytelling, brand identity, and so on. If a viewer became a fan of a specific YouTuber, they didn't need an algorithm to keep them coming back. They would subscribe and even get alerted to the new content. Likewise, viewers were frequently exposed to new YouTubers when they would collaborate with others, appearing directly in each other's content. Throughout my research, I came to argue that even if YouTube removed its recommendation algorithm tomorrow, there still would be major challenges ahead for the platform in looking to curb white and male supremacist propaganda. Today, I'm actually going to take this argument even further. I'm still not going to attempt to answer the question of whether the YouTube algorithm brings people down to far-right rabbit holes. I'm going to reject that question altogether. I'm going to argue that the framing of this question actually bakes in some incorrect assumptions about how supremacist movements, conspiracy theories, and political groups more broadly use the internet. And when we base our research questions on these faulty assumptions, we miss the opportunity to ask questions that can actually reveal the dynamics occurring online. And one way that I've shifted the way that I'm thinking about why this is unproductive, I used to focus more on the algorithm itself. Now I'm actually taking issue with the use of the rabbit hole metaphor and how it structures the way that we understand how the algorithm works. So let's talk about the metaphor of the rabbit hole. This may seem like an overly abstract or frivolous exercise, but I think it's actually fundamental to the way we think about political media online. In their classic work on the power of metaphors, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argued that metaphors not only reflect our understanding of reality, but they also help construct it. So therefore, the metaphors we choose to use actually shape how we think about certain phenomena. And the rabbit hole metaphor for radicalization is no different. As I'm sure many here know, the metaphor of the rabbit hole originates from Lewis Carroll's book, Alice in Wonderland, which was published in 1865. In the fantasy book, the protagonist Alice falls down a literal rabbit hole and finds the strange and fantastical world of Wonderland at the other end. The rabbit hole also acts as a symbolic representation of Alice's journey into the strange and uncharted territories of adolescence. Since its original use in literature, the rabbit hole has become an enduring and flexible metaphor, used to reference everything from LSD trips to the Matrix. When the World Wide Web became a global phenomenon in the 1990s, people began using spatial metaphors to describe the internet. One of the earliest was the information superhighway, pictured here, which helped illustrate how the internet facilitates the rapid transmission of messages around the world. The idea is that these spatial metaphors helped people make sense of the strangeness and the newness of the internet, which seems to operate outside the laws of space and time. By the early 2000s, the internet began to feel less like a vast, unmapped territory, and new metaphors emerged that focused more on the internet's presumed depth. Specifically, with the proliferation of things like Bitcoin and anonymous proxy networks, and as kind of, quote unquote, bad behavior spread throughout the internet, journalists began referring to things such as the deep web, the dark net, the dark web, and so on. And while each term technically has its own distinct meaning, the conflation between them led to a kind of unified, messy conception of an internet underworld below the surface of the rest of the internet, where all of the moral violations on the internet take place. But those claims have always been far more symbolic than empirically driven. For example, protesters in authoritarian regimes frequently use the so-called dark web to avoid detection. It's not only filled with kind of immoral actors. And at the same time, white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements frequently operate directly on social media platforms. When we talk about a YouTube rabbit hole of algorithmic radicalization, we draw on the same tropes and symbolism. We suggest that there is a stable, dark underbelly of YouTube that would remain largely untouched, except that the recommendation algorithm draws in viewers and brings them tumbling down. Or conversely, we may suggest that the algorithm doesn't bring people tumbling down, and thus that the content in Wonderland sits relatively unvisited. This is the imagery and the symbolism that I want to challenge. And in the process, I'll end up critiquing much of the academic literature and journalism about political content on YouTube, including at times my own previous research. Despite not writing about the algorithm, I've still in the past employed the imagery of pathways, pipelines, and even rabbit holes. But now I'm going to outline several assumptions baked into this conception of online propaganda that I want to argue are fundamentally untrue. The first of these assumptions is that white supremacist and male supremacist ideas, as well as conspiracy theories and disinformation, are somehow fringe and easily separated from mainstream discourse. In reality, the boundaries between the far right and mainstream conservatism have always been deeply contested, as have the more general boundaries between what's considered extreme versus mainstream. The boundaries move over time depending on the norms and beliefs of a given era, and at times the distinctions collapse altogether. This means that the very definition of extremism is open to debate and far from settled. Importantly, researchers of extremism, such as J.M. Berger, argue that extremist beliefs are not necessarily fringe beliefs. Berger defines extremism as the belief that an in-group success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an outgroup. Importantly, this definition has nothing to do with how close one's politics hew to the center of national discourse. As Berger notes, successful and important historical regimes were both dominant and extremist. And in particular, he references Nazi Germany and institutionalized racial slavery in America. He says both of those were kind of the widespread norm at the time in their respective countries, and also were extremist regimes. To illustrate the difficulties in distinguishing fringe from mainstream discourse and beliefs, I want to briefly discuss the Great Replacement theory. So the Great Replacement theory is traditionally a white nationalist conspiracy theory that asserts that so-called elites, which is often code for Jewish people, are orchestrating the replacement of white citizens of a given country with people of color through immigration and other demographic shifts. So I'm going to read 4 quotes from 4 different men who have all promoted strikingly similar versions of the Great Replacement theory in very different contexts. And by way of warning, these quotes are quite disturbing and racist. The first quote reads, "This is ethnic replacement. This is cultural replacement. This is racial replacement." This was written in the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter, the man who in 2019 carried out a terrorist attack against Muslims in New Zealand, killing 51 people and injuring another 40. The second quote, spoken by a different man, reads, "We are becoming a displaced minority in our own country thanks to Democrat policies. They tax the hell out of middle-class families who might want to have more children while paying for welfare queens to have 5 or 6 babies they can't support." This quote comes from, let's see, is it going to appear? All right, well, you get 2 for 1. There we go. This one comes from Jason Kessler, who's a neo-Nazi and white supremacist, who was the primary organizer of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. The third quote is, "Deputize a citizen force, put them on the border, give them handcuffs, get it done. Sure, that's dramatic. You know what's dramatic? The invasion of the country. The other side has openly admitted that this is about bringing in voters and decreasing white demographics in America." This quote comes from Charlie Kirk, who is considered a mainstream conservative activist and a founder of the conservative nonprofit organization Turning Point USA, which is considered the dominant force in contemporary campus conservatism. And finally, the last quote I'll read is, "There's an unrelenting stream of immigrants meant to change the racial mix of the country, to reduce the political power of people whose ancestors live here, and dramatically increase the proportions of Americans newly arrived from the third world." And that quote comes from Tucker Carlson, the primetime television host on Fox News, whose show is the single most watched cable news program in the United States. I'm bringing up these 4 men and their quotes not to make any definitive statement about the current Republican Party, and its relationship to white nationalism, and also not to claim that these four men all hold the same views on other issues, because they don't. I'm also not trying to make normative claims that these four men's content should be treated in the same way by social media platforms. What I am doing is trying to use this illustration to surface the genuine theoretical and methodological challenges that arise when, as researchers, we attempt to draw strict lines between categories when the empirical data does not give us any evidence that these lines necessarily exist. The blurring of these boundaries fundamentally challenges the conception that a person has to be incrementally brought down a rabbit hole by an algorithm to be exposed to extremist or white supremacist content. This relates to the second assumption I want to discuss here. And this assumption is that there's a clear difference between mainstream and alternative media, as well as between objective and partisan reporting. Historically, the term mainstream media has been used to refer to mass media that reaches many people, as opposed to more localized or niche media outlets. It's also been used to refer to media that's part of a larger corporate and institutional structure, as opposed to outlets that are run independently by individuals or collectives or even nonprofits. However, in the contemporary media environment, the term mainstream media has become vague to the point of conceptual uselessness. It's frequently used to convey the moral or political stance of the person using the term more than any reflection of a genuine phenomenon. Conservatives and progressive media figures alike frequently use it to reference any kind of media with a center liberal political slant. However, according to this definition, even small independent and individual content creators are frequently lumped in with the mainstream if they simply reflect a liberal outlook in their broadcasts. Others refer to the mainstream media as media with institutional affiliations and resources. A news network connected to a major media conglomerate is considered more mainstream than an individual live streaming from their bedroom. But institutional affiliations and resources, especially on the internet, come in many shapes and sizes. YouTube, the platform, for example, frequently forms partnerships with its bigger content creators, giving them access to its studios and other resources. Some political YouTubers also have partnerships with political donors who help fund their work behind the scenes or in public. They may also work quasi-independently but sit under the umbrella of a broader media organization. Institutionally entrenched media organizations, meanwhile, have moved into the world of blogging and newsletters, while YouTubers who are popular enough build up their own studios. Nor is there a clear distinction between what size of audience constitutes mainstream versus alternative. When Fox News first went on the air in 1996, it was the alternative upstart to counter the three mainstream network stations. Now it still uses that positioning, but it frequently beats out all other cable and network stations in viewership metrics. Today, individual political YouTubers and podcasters regularly reach a wider audience than institutions such as the New York Times, for example, even though the latter is frequently assumed to be more mainstream than the former. Finally, some people may measure mainstream media by whether it's profit-seeking, and if so, how big its profits are. Yet some of the most influential and widely viewed political content on YouTube comes from nonprofits, such as the conservative media organization Prager University. Despite not seeking a profit, PragerU has major financial resources to draw on, and it uses them to reach an incredibly large audience. On the other hand, every piece of speech posted to social media platforms becomes a commodity against which those platforms can drive their own profits. This means that even individuals who are not looking to make money with their political content are still operating within an environment shaped by business interests. In some forthcoming research I've done with my colleague Angèle Christin, we found that through content analysis, creator interviews, and digital ethnography, that a more productive way of understanding media dynamics on platforms is by looking at all of the groups that have some form of agency in these environments and how they wield them against each other in a somewhat chaotic environment. This includes, but isn't limited to, individual content creators, media organizations, audiences, and YouTube or other platforms. Each of these groups has some although unequal, levels of agency to assert their voices collectively or individually within platform media environments. The conflicts between these groups become moments of tension and drama, and the term mainstream media is frequently wielded by each of these groups, whether pejoratively or approvingly. Importantly, though, we treated these claims as part of our empirical data rather than building a framework that attempts to distinguish mainstream from alternative. So up until now, I've been critiquing the idea that there are two separate worlds of content, mainstream and alternative, as well as the idea that there's two separate worlds of kind of ideology, mainstream and extreme. The lines between these worlds are actually unstable at best. And if we genuinely start from the empirical data, it becomes nearly impossible to create clear distinctions between these worlds, the figurative worlds of above ground England and below ground Wonderland. To be fair, much of the research on YouTube radicalization has grappled with this challenge, at least to some extent, attempting to treat online political media as a spectrum rather than a world with clear divides. However, I want to challenge that assumption as well, the assumption that political media operates on a clear left, center, right spectrum. First, just as there are definitional challenges around extremism, there are similar challenges here as well. Every scholar of the far right will tell you that there's no clearly accepted definitions in the field of just what exactly constitutes the far right, as opposed to just mainstream right, center right, conservative right, or so on. Nor is there any clear agreement on how the so-called far right differs from similar categories like the radical right, the extreme right, or the reactionary right. Some research gets its categories from charts like this one, which was developed by an organization called Ad Fontes Media. These types of charts use a axis looking at bias from left to right, and then on the y-axis we have kind of reliability, whether it has news value or not. I could spend an entire session making a methodological critique of this single chart, but I'll restrain myself and simply cite the Association of College and Research Libraries, who write that it superimposes a false equivalency between the media and the worlds, between the media worlds of left and the right, which historically have been quite distinct, both in size and makeup. It also lionizes a political center and equates it with a lack of bias. So all of the media outlets that they consider to be kind of the most centrist or central, those are the ones that that they say are the most reliable, which actually is a highly contested issue, right? Someone can have kind of a very strongly partisan mindset, but still also be conveying only facts and not promoting disinformation, right? So there's a lot of conflation going on. But perhaps most importantly for what I want to discuss here, these types of charts also suggest that contemporary media producers fit neatly along a left-right spectrum. And that's exactly what I contest here. There are certain partisan media outlets and creators who act as kind of mouthpieces for either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But just as often, media outlets and creators are far more concerned with cultural politics than electoral politics. And those don't always fall as neatly along kind of a left-right paradigm. As Alexandra Stern has noted in her research on contemporary white supremacy, many white supremacists in particular are concerned with a kind of meta-politics. That is, they attempt to reframe the very nature of the political debates we have, rather than to debate things at the policy level or at the level of political candidates. These charts also end up obscuring the degree to which political content on social media platforms transcends traditional left-right divides. One such popular online subculture, for example, is known as Nazbol, short for National Bolshevism, a radical political movement that combines elements of far-right ultranationalism and far-left communism. Other individual creators will pull together an eclectic mix of positions, not least of all because this can help differentiate them in a market saturated with other political content creators. And sometimes this can be a mix of different ideologies. Sometimes it can be a mix of an ideology with an unexpected style or format for this ideology. It can really become a mishmash. So for example, the YouTuber Vosh claims to be a leftist, but he also attempts to draw in disaffected young white males as his audience by using shocking and sometimes regressive language and ideas. This is also, by the way, not an exclusive feature to YouTube. So for example, the very public media personality, Glenn Greenwald, who runs a Substack newsletter, combines an anti-authoritarian approach to free speech and data with an anti-Bolsonaro approach to Brazilian politics. He lives in Brazil. But at the same time, he targets anyone in the United States he deems to be liberal. And he's also a frequent guest on and defender of Tucker Carlson. All of this is in part why I have ultimately recently started following some of my colleagues and shifting away from discussions of the far right or the extremist right, and instead try as much as possible to refer primarily to white and male supremacist media. These terms make no presumptions about how fringe or widespread this content is, or what their relationship to partisan politics is. I've also in the past identified specific networks of creators and assessed their politics more according to their rejection of social justice movements than their affiliation with any party or partisan position. Some other researchers have done this as well, attempting to break YouTube political content down into more granular categories that aren't fixed on a left-right continuum. So for example, now we're starting to see researchers, looking at groups that they're calling anti-woke or anti-SJW or alt-right or alt-light. I believe this is a step in the right direction, but I think it also comes with its own risks and pitfalls, which brings me to assumption number 4. When we assume that people get drawn down into rabbit holes of content, we suggest that viewers figuratively move over time and space, but that ideas and channels stay fixed. It's Alice who falls down the rabbit hole, but Wonderland and England don't move at all. In reality, though, the worlds of online subcultural communities are constantly in flux, and thus are highly difficult to categorize with any stability for any significant period of time. For example, it may surprise some people to learn that the so-called alt-right, which was on the rise in 2016 and 2017, essentially does not exist anymore. It was always essentially a rebranding effort of white nationalism, but now it's no longer something that anyone uses to identify themselves as. People especially became reluctant to call themselves alt-right after the Charlottesville, Virginia march in 2017, which many white supremacists saw as a PR disaster. The event also led to a lot of infighting, and over the course of the next year, they kind of fell apart as a unified coalition. However, the collapse of the alt-right as a loosely unified movement does not mean there are fewer white supremacists online. Instead, many people who formerly identified as alt-right rebranded themselves or shifted the way they expressed their white supremacy. Some became involved in the emergent QAnon movement. Others went on to join nationalist militias. Some denounced the movement and sought out more respectable careers in politics. By the way, I'll mention that this slide is highly imprecise, so please don't take these dates as set in stone and don't take them as a marker of definitive beginning and endings. The main point I'm trying to convey is through digital ethnography, you come to find that individual subcultural movements rise and fall relatively quickly, but also that they're not actually accurate ways of gauging the longer term trends. So the smaller movements come and go, but a lot of the longer term trends kind of stick around much longer. It's important to separate the two. Likewise, individual content creators come and go with lightning speed. Some find themselves on the outs of a movement after infighting. This is what happened with Richard Spencer, who was once the poster boy of the alt-right, but who now holds little to no influence in the white supremacist movement. Others lose influence after social media platforms ban their accounts, and some simply lose popularity with audiences over time, while others grow. For example, we can see here that Sargon of Akkad, who was once a highly popular and influential anti-feminist YouTuber, has now been steadily losing followers over the course of the past year. On the other hand, Tim Pool, a man who has consistently promoted conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, among other topics, has seen his subscriber count grow in the same time period. At the same time, entirely new names and figures have cropped up on other platforms such as Twitch, TikTok, and Telegram. Equally importantly, the politics of individual YouTubers change over time too. The pressure to stay relevant and please audiences online means that it's difficult to find an individual content creator whose public politics have not shifted in some capacity over time. This can happen in any number of ways. Dave Rubin, for example, who's up on the screen right now, very publicly shifted his public politics over time between 2015 and 2019, inching away from his previous professed liberalism and toward libertarianism and later traditional conservatism. He even capitalized on the shift, making videos about why he left the left. On the other hand, creators like Hunter Avallone have moved away from conservatism. Avallone made his name on YouTube with anti-feminist videos, but now he's come to embrace some social justice issues and makes content in which he playfully debunks his older videos. So here it says Hunter Avallone wrecks Hunter Avallone with facts and logic. The constant flux of online content creators and their political networks has huge methodological repercussions. Multiple studies take lists of YouTubers developed in 2017 or 2018 and analyze them now to make judgments about the success or failure of the algorithm to draw people in. But as risky as it is to try to classify channels in the moment, it becomes even riskier to rely on those categorizations years later. Claims that right-wing viewership peaked in a certain year, for example, actually more accurately show that specific right-wing creators are no longer as popular as they once were. But it's important to see who and what has filled the vacuum, or if nothing has. I also want to address the assumption that ideas stay fixed within specific regions of the internet or social media platforms. In fact, as we all know, individual conspiracy theories and pieces of disinformation can spread like wildfire across a range of media. In this case, YouTubers and other political creators can act as amplifiers of white supremacist ideas, bringing them to bigger and bigger audiences. In my research conducted with Alice Marwick, we traced the movement of some of these conspiracy theories. So the case here shows the pathway of a white supremacist conspiracy theory, which promoted the idea that there was a genocide of white farmers taking place in South Africa, conducted by Black Africans. This theory circulated for several years in explicitly far-right spaces, especially the white supremacist forum Stormfront. In 2018, it got picked up by the YouTuber Lauren Southern. Southern posted a video and promoted it as a documentary, even as it promoted the empirically false white genocide theory. Her video is currently still on YouTube and has over 2.6 million views. Her video helped popularize the theory on YouTube and among several other creators on the platform. 2 months later, Tucker Carlson, who had previously spoken favorably about Lauren Southern on his program, began promoting the conspiracy theory on his primetime Fox show. The same evening as Carlson's broadcast, Trump, who at the time was still president, publicly stated that he had asked the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to, quote, closely study the South Africa land and farm seizures and expropriations and the large-scale killings of farmers, unquote. So I know I'm running short on time, so this is the last assumption I have. I'll run through it really quickly. This is really the only one where I'm going back and actually talking about the algorithm itself. I think that when we attach the algorithm to the rabbit hole metaphor, we end up assuming that the algorithm acts upon us as humans rather than having it be an interactive process where algorithms act on us and we act on them in return and shape each other. Again, with the metaphor, it's like, the rabbit hole is causing Alice to fall, or maybe it's the rabbit is pushing her in and she's falling down. Whereas actually there's much more of a back and forth process. In some ways, this repeats the theory that we in communication studies call the hypodermic needle theory of media. The idea that propaganda is presented to us and we kind of accept it immediately with no pushback or critical thinking. The hypodermic needle model has been disregarded in my field for decades, but as other scholars have noted, it seems to have made a strange return in our discourses about media and the internet. So I think it's important for us to ask, if an algorithm serves up white supremacist content, how likely is someone to click on it? What factors lead someone to engage or not engage? How do audiences intake these messages? And so on. And likewise, as my colleague Angèle Costin has argued, we all too often attempt to make research claims about algorithms as if they exist in a vacuum, when in reality, there's a deep need to assess the actual practices surrounding algorithmic technologies. So for example, YouTube creators themselves are deeply aware of the importance of the algorithm. They shape their content to try to maximize the way that it will be shown in algorithms. And that's an important factor about how the algorithms work. At the same time, users are frequently quite savvy to how the algorithms are surfacing content, and sometimes even try to game the algorithm or subvert it in various ways by making strange clicking choices. So my talk today has been a very critical one, but I don't want people to leave with a sense that I'm merely nitpicking about methodological challenges. Embedded in my critiques is a larger argument about the conceptual categories we use to analyze politics, media, and technology. Each one of my critiques has been about the breakdown of previously stable categories, or else about the fact that these categories never ultimately existed in a stable state. The problem of trying to use these categories to analyze the online media is that the collapse of these categories is precisely one of the phenomena we need to be researching. In other words, I propose that an important way forward is to shift many of the categories we currently use as conceptual tools into our objects of research. As is, the categories we think with are too conceptually muddy to be effectively precise, and at the same time too rigid to capture the fluidity of the online environment. In fact, I haven't talked about it at all today, but my colleagues Alice Marwick, Benjamin Clancy, and Katie Furl actually argue in an upcoming research publication that even the term we use, radicalization, is unclear, and that researchers are deeply conflicted about what it actually means to become radicalized. I think that this is, it can be scary because it takes us back a few steps before where we want to be. But I also think it's exciting, that it's an exciting moment for us as researchers to be able to challenge a lot of our ways of thinking, and hopefully to find newer and more creative ways to gauge exactly what we're seeing online today. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, Becca, thank you so much. It was really, really great to see this new research. And you might want to go ahead and stop sharing your slides now.
That sounds great. Stop share.
Thank you. So I have a bunch of questions. I also want to know, and so I'll start with a few of them, but also want to invite our audience to go ahead and chime in. And so if there are questions from the audience, you can go ahead and enter those in the Q&A section, and I will do my best in the last 10 or 15 minutes that we have to moderate those. But wanted to start back up with a question for you. I've always appreciated the qualitative ethnographic research that you and others at Data and Society and colleagues at UNC have done. I think in the past, we've had a lot of discussions with people doing more quantitative research, downloading massive data sets from Twitter and elsewhere. Would love to hear a bit more about the challenges that you experience in doing this kind of qualitative research. And then also, if and when you sort of overlay that with a quantitative understanding of, for example, how many of these influencers there are, what their reach is, what we think about as impact. So how do you see the sort of ethnographic and the more quantitative research intersecting?
That's such a great question. And I think that one of the most important things that we could do as researchers in the coming weeks and months and years is to work more together between the qualitative and the quantitative sides of this. As a qualitative researcher, I think my presentation probably, ended up intentionally or unintentionally at times revealing kind of some of the value I find in the qualitative approach, because what happens is when you sit and you watch and take notes on hours and hours and hours of content, and you watch ideas traveling kind of through and see, kind of be along for the ride and see where the ideas travel to, and look in the member communities and see how they're talking about YouTube on other platforms like Reddit and so on. That's when you really get to see some of these nuances that I think you might not otherwise see. You can download kind of, millions of videos and their metadata, but if you're not actually watching them and seeing kind of, oh, actually, this isn't fitting kind of as neatly along political lines as we might think, then that's going to be kind of a major gap in the research. On the flip side, for me, I have the problem of scale, and other qualitative researchers do too, that the pure amount of data and video content on YouTube is staggering. And there's simply, I talk with other qualitative researchers of kind of white supremacist and male supremacist movements about this, that we find it deeply frustrating. There's just not enough time in the day. There's so much happening in these communities that it's impossible to look at such a granular level, everything. And so I think sharing and communicating between researchers becomes really important. And that's where I think that kind of working together between qualitative researchers and quantitative researchers becomes so important, because quant scholars can do more measuring at scale, understanding impact, kind of looking at statistical significance. But when I work with them, I can jump in and say, I don't think it's actually accurate to, put a whole bin of people into this far right category versus central right category. So the times that I've worked together with quant scholars, I think, have been some of the most exciting and productive times to think about YouTube and far right content.
Yeah, thank you. And I have to say, I've never envied you or Alice or Joan in the amount of time you must spend actually watching video after video. So thank you for your service in doing that. I think another question that comes up for me is just what you think of as the implications of these findings and some of your past research when you talk about, the algorithm not necessarily being the dispositive influence here, and so much of it being about sort of cults of personalities. What you think of as the implications of your research for potential solutions here or platform interventions. Like, I can imagine if it's a more of a sort of tribal cult of personality following, fact checking might not be as effective. Maybe some of the implications are more around the incentive structures that YouTube itself is setting up. But how do you think about either what solutions might be, or what you take away as like, oh, definitely this is not going to work?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating and difficult question. I'm much better at looking at the problems and thinking about the problems than at thinking about solutions, which also is why I think it's important to talk with policy folks and legal scholars as well, who are much better at that side of it. But I think that, you mentioned actually one of the main things that I think is not going to solve this problem, which is fact checking, or using fact checking as a mode through which, we should make algorithmic decisions, like as this a more factual channel than the other. And that's exactly because of the kind of cult of personality piece that you described, that white supremacist content on YouTube, sometimes it deals in disinformation, but just as frequently, it's people telling personal stories about how they came to adopt white supremacist views and why they're so much happier now that they did that. And almost like a product testimonial, right? I mean, it really is. They're using brand influencer strategies, whether they're aware of it or not, but essentially using that to sell people on white supremacist and male supremacist ideas. And in that sense, it's more like propaganda. I mean, my colleague Caroline Jack does incredible work looking at the various kind of differences between propaganda and disinformation and all of these different words that we have going back and forth. And I think that in terms of pure fact checking, that really only captures like a really small slice of it. I think much more the dealing with content moderation and explicitly basing that content moderation on a much clearer and more transparent set of values is particularly important. In fact, the way that YouTube operates now, part of the problem is that because they're operating at such scale, they rely on algorithms to do content moderation as well. And they're also kind of, relying on human moderators who have to make difficult decisions as well. But inevitably, it means there's so much inconsistency in how these things get applied. And when you go back and look at their policies, a lot of that is because it's really difficult to create kind of policies that espouse any actual set of clear values without angering some amount of the user base. And so that kind of puts YouTube in an impossible bind. And it also leaves this vacuum where no one operating on YouTube is quite clear what is valued or not valued there. And that actually can cause a great deal of anxiety for a lot of creators, and actually can increase conspiracy theorizing, interestingly.
Great, thank you. And we have a question here from actually about investors in this space. What should be the role of corporate investors in this paradigm of online extremism? And actually from Hi Bruce is an investor in the area. I have some thoughts on that. I'm curious, Becca, if you have thoughts on the role of corporate investors in online extremism.
That's a really great question. And I don't think I have a great answer. So Kelly, I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we thought a bit about actually. And while I was at Stanford, had this dream of pulling together venture capitalists who are investing in sort of the next generation of technologies to do some scenario planning and sort of pressure testing of emerging technologies to think about the implications that they would have, on society and democracy in the future. So I think from my view, there are questions about existing technologies that are out there and how we try and address YouTube and Facebook, some of these larger ones, versus the role of emerging technologies. I think one of the pieces, and this actually comes out in Rob Reich's latest book with others at Stanford, is this whole idea of blitz scaling and the pressures that investors are putting on new technologists to really rapidly get to market before they've really pressure tested these technologies to understand the security risks, the social risks, and so forth. So I continue to think there's a lot of work to be done by the investor community that both benefits society and will ultimately make sense for the bottom line as well. So they avoid some of these, for example, whistleblower events and things like that we're seeing at Facebook now, right? I think you can make an economic case for starting to think more in advance about this. Okay, I have not had a chance to screen these, so give me just a second. Becca, how do you draw the line between influencers and people who are just sharing their videos? How do you know who gets paid by outside sponsors and think tanks? And I'm guessing there's some quantitative number if you're an influencer once you hit a certain threshold, but yeah, how do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my answer to that is yet another case where we have this kind of category collapse that there's no one clear answer to when someone becomes an influencer or not. And in fact, of the creators that I've interviewed with my colleague Angèle Christin, a lot of them told us that they had a moment of kind of realization, oh, I guess I'm kind of an influencer now. It's not like there was this threshold that they passed where it's yes, I've entered into being an influencer. It was that, somehow they maybe made a mistake and upset their audience members, or they realized that they had an impact on someone else's life with what they said. Somehow it became clear to them that they were kind of wielding more power than they realized they had. And that's how they came to define kind of being an influencer, actually. Some other people, define it more based on, oh, I've got a brand deal. Now that means I'm a brand influencer. YouTube itself does have several thresholds. Once you hit a certain amount of subscribers and, as they call it, watch hours, you can be entered into the YouTube Partner Program, or the YPP as they call it. And it's only after that, and they've reviewed your content and made sure everything's kind of on the up and up, that then you can start getting a percentage of the ad revenue that is placed in front of your videos. And then on top of that, there are certain more perks that come once you've gained, hit other thresholds, 100,000, 10,000 viewers, or 10,000 subscribers versus 100,000 versus 1 million, and so on. Which actually in some ways reflects a little bit of what we saw about Facebook this week and their whitelist of users, except that it's always been public on YouTube. They've been quite open about the fact that this is their system, but still it's what Robin Kaplan and Tarleton Gillespie call tiered governance. There's a tiered governance system on YouTube, and bigger creators do get special treatment.
Thanks, Becca. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So we have about a 1 minute response to this one, but just any historical antecedents that you're familiar with, other sort of rabbit hole moments that we've seen in media radicalization, and how relevant you think those are to this contemporary moment.
Oh, yes. Oh, boy. I won't be able to answer this in 1 minute. So
I know, good luck. That was sort of an unfair setup, but.
No. It's a great question. I mean, one that I think about a lot is the resurgent Klan, Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And actually, they created an entire kind of alternative media ecosystem. And they also were really, really savvy about getting their rallies into the mainstream media. Which at the time there was kind of a more, bounded mainstream media. And they were just incredibly PR savvy. They knew how to get attention, and they had their own media. And I think there's a lot of parallels to today, actually.
Yeah, it was really amazing to see how they were able to take that movement and get the mainstream media to start to amplify it. Well, Becca, thank you so much. Really great to see you as always, and really appreciate the time that you have taken here. We will close now after that thank you with just a quick update of events at Stanford that are coming up. I think we have a slide about that. We have quite a lot weekly. It's always at the same time, so 12 o'clock till 1 o'clock. We have a variety of folks hosting this. The next one I'll be doing will be with David Kaye, who was the UN Special Rapporteur, looking at a lot of these questions around speech, but a really great set of speakers coming up. So hope to see some of you there. And Becca, thank you again so much. I think Haifa just put into the link a way to register for those who want to. But Becca, thank you. Nate, great to see you, and congratulations on the legislation you introduced today. And thanks again, everyone, for joining.